The name hit her like a bullet she had been waiting 2 seasons to catch. Myrtle Reed. Samuel Lawson said it quietly, the way a man says something he has been rehearsing alone in the dark, and the entire dining room of the Copper Bell Hotel went silent around them. Not because he had shouted it, not because he had drawn iron or slammed a fist on the table. He said it soft and deliberate, the way a key sounds when it finally finds the right lock, and that quietness was the most terrifying thing Myrtle had ever heard in her life. She did not drop the coffee pot she was holding. She was proud of that later, in the long hours when she turned the moment over and over like a stone in her palm. Her hand did not shake. Her face did not change. She had spent 22 months learning how to make her face into something as smooth and unreadable as the flat desert floor outside Redemption, Arizona, and that training held even now, even when the ground was collapsing beneath her boots. She set the coffee pot down on the table in front of the Marshal. She looked at him. He looked at her. His brown eyes were steady and careful and unbearably kind, which was somehow worse than anger would have been. Anger she could have fought. Kindness made her want to confess everything all at once, to pour it all out like water from a broken dam, and she could not afford that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. "I think," she said, her voice belonging to a woman named Clara Wells, a woman she had built from nothing in the spring of 1881, "that you have me confused with someone else, Marshal." Samuel Lawson picked up his coffee cup. He wrapped both hands around it the way a man does when the desert night has come down cold, and he looked at her over the rim of it with an expression that broke something inside her chest. "No," he said, "I don't." She walked away from his table with her back straight and her steps measured, and she went through the kitchen door and stood with her back against the wall and pressed both hands flat against the rough plaster, and breath through her nose until the shaking that she had refused to show him passed through her body and was gone. And then she stood there in the heat of the kitchen with the smell of biscuits and lard and wood smoke all around her, and she thought about the long road that had brought her to this moment, and she understood with terrible clarity that it was ending, that everything she had built here, every careful brick of it, was about to come down. She had come to Redemption, Arizona in the early autumn of 1881, arriving on the weekly stage from Tucson on a Wednesday afternoon when the heat still sat on the land like a living thing, and the dust rose in columns wherever the wind touched it. She had told the stagecoach driver her name was Clara Wells. She had told the woman at the hotel the same thing. She had repeated it to the schoolteacher, to the blacksmith, to the preacher's wife, and to Dottie Crane, who ran the Copper Bell Hotel and needed a girl who could serve meals and clean rooms and do it all without complaining. Clara Wells. She had worn the name like a coat, had lived inside it, had let it become so familiar that there were mornings when she woke in the small room above the hotel kitchen and genuinely forgot, for the first blurred seconds of consciousness, that it was not hers. Her real name was Myrtle Reed, and the story of that name was the story of everything she was running from. She had been born in 1858 in Galveston, Texas, the third daughter of a cotton merchant named Everett Reed, who had money and ambition, and a temper that he kept behind closed doors where the neighbors could not see it. Her mother, a woman of great beauty and very little power, had died of fever when Myrtle was 11, and after that the household had reorganized itself around her father's the way iron filings arrange themselves around a magnet. Her 2 older sisters married young and moved away, which Myrtle understood even then as a form of survival, and she was left behind in that house in Galveston with a father who was not cruel in the obvious ways but was controlling in ways that were harder to name and therefore harder to fight. She had been clever in school. She had been better than clever, actually. She had possessed the kind of mind that absorbed language and numbers and ideas the way dry earth absorbs rain, quickly and completely, and without leaving much evidence that anything had passed through. She had read everything she could get her hands on, which in Galveston in the 1870s was not as little as you might think, and she had taught herself enough of the law from borrowed texts to know that as an unmarried woman living under her father's roof, she had almost none of it protecting her. At 22, her father had arranged a marriage for her with a man named Douglas Whitmore. Douglas Whitmore was 41 years old, which her father considered a mark of stability, and Myrtle considered a reason to feel sick every time she thought about it. He was a business associate of her father's, a man who owned cattle and a chunk of land outside Houston and had already buried one wife, a woman whose name no one seemed to remember clearly, which Myrtle found both telling and deeply frightening. He was not physically ugly. He was simply a man who looked at her the way men sometimes look at property they are considering purchasing, calculating worth and checking for flaws, and there was something in his eyes when he did it that made the back of her neck go cold. She had refused, quietly at first, then clearly, then with a firmness that surprised even herself. Her father had not accepted the refusal. The situation had escalated through the autumn and winter of 1880 in ways she still did not like to dwell on too long, because dwelling made her feel powerless all over again, and she had worked hard not to feel that way. There had been threats, legal and otherwise. There had been a locked door and 2 weeks of what her father called reflection, and what Myrtle called imprisonment. And then one night in February of 1881, when the cold came off the Gulf in long, steady sheets of wind, she had climbed out of a window and walked 3 miles to the rail station with a carpetbag that held everything she had decided she could not leave behind. She had $47 and a stub of pencil and 3 books and a change of clothes and a small photograph of her mother. She had a name that she left behind on purpose. And she had, buried at the very bottom of the bag under everything else, a folded document that she had taken from her father's desk on the same night she climbed out the window. The document was a letter of credit and a property deed, and it belonged to Douglas Whitmore, and she had taken it because she had reasoned that a man missing those particular papers would be too occupied with the legal mess of recovering them to come looking for her immediately. She had been right about that, but only for a while. She had ridden the train west, changing lines twice, and had eventually found herself in Tucson, which was far enough from Galveston and busy enough with its own concerns that no one looked at her twice. She had spent 3 months there, working as a laundress, before she heard about redemption from a woman on the street who was passing through on her way to California. A small town, the woman said, a hotel that needed workers, a place that did not ask too many questions because everyone there was, in one way or another, starting something over. That had sounded like salvation. She had taken the next stage. Redemption was everything the woman had described and a little more besides. It sat in a valley between 2 long ridges of red rock, and at certain times of day, when the light came in from the west, it looked like the whole world was made of fire and rust, and something that had almost been beautiful once. It had a main street with a handful of businesses arranged along it like teeth in a jaw, a church at one end and a jail at the other, a well in the center of the square that everyone gathered around in the mornings, because gathering around the well was how redemption told itself the news. Dottie Crane had hired her within an hour of her stepping off the stage, which Myrtle had always suspected was less about her qualifications and more about the fact that the previous serving girl had run off with a cattle hand the week before, and Dottie was desperate. But Dottie did not ask for letters of reference. She asked whether Myrtle, or Clara as she was then, could carry a heavy tray without spilling, and Myrtle said yes, and Dottie said good, and that had been that. She had settled into her role at the Copper Bell with the thoroughness she applied to everything. She learned everyone's name. She learned their habits and their preferences and what they liked to talk about. She learned who was kind and who was difficult and who needed to be handled gently. She made herself useful in every way she could think of, because usefulness was invisibility of a particular kind, the kind where people see you clearly enough to appreciate you and not clearly enough to wonder about you. The townspeople of Redemption liked Clara Wells. They trusted her. Old Thomas Biggs, who came in for breakfast every morning without fail, said she was the finest coffee maker in the territory, and he would fight any man who disagreed. Preacher Halloway's wife, Margaret, often sat with her on the hotel porch in the late afternoons and talked about the Bible and about gardens, and about what she missed from back east, and she always seemed to feel better afterward, which made Myrtle feel good in a way that was both genuine and complicated, because it was real friendship built on a foundation of fiction. She had been in Redemption for 6 months when Samuel Lawson arrived. He rode in on a gray horse on a cold January morning in 1882, and she saw him from the hotel window before he ever set foot inside. He was tall and lean in the specific way of men who work outdoors in all weathers, with shoulders that pulled at the seams of his coat, and a way of sitting the horse that suggested he and the animal had come to a mutual understanding some years ago. He wore a Marshal's badge on his chest, and he wore it plainly, without the slight puffed posture that some lawmen adopted around it. He looked like a man who took the work seriously without being in love with the authority. He came into the Copper Bell that evening for supper, and Myrtle took his order, and he said thank you when she brought his food and thank you again when she brought his coffee, and he did not look at her in the calculating way that Douglas Whitmore had once looked at her, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. He had been sent to Redemption because of trouble with cattle thieves operating in the territory between Redemption and the New Mexico border, which was a serious enough problem in the winter of 1882 that the territorial office in Tucson had assigned a marshal specifically to the region, rather than continuing to rely on the part-time sheriff who spent half his time running his own cattle operation. Samuel Lawson had a reputation, though he did not seem to know it, or if he knew it, he did not wear it. He had brought in men that other marshals had given up on finding. He was patient and methodical and extraordinarily good at reading landscapes, both the physical kind and the human kind. Myrtle learned these things gradually, the way you learn things in a small town, by listening to conversations you are nominally not part of while refilling coffee cups and clearing plates. She was very good at that kind of listening. She had been doing it most of her life. Samuel took a room at the Copper Bell because it was the only hotel in Redemption and because Dottie's rates were reasonable. This meant that Myrtle saw him at breakfast and supper most days, and sometimes in between when he came in out of the cold for coffee while he was working. He was quiet in the way of men who are comfortable with silence, not sullen but contained, as if he had learned to store himself efficiently against future need. He read when he ate alone, which she respected. He brought his dishes to the kitchen window himself when he was done, which Dottie said was unusual and Myrtle thought was simply considerate. The first real conversation they had happened in late February, on a night when a late-season storm had come down off the mountains and closed everything in with cold and driven snow, which was unusual enough in southern Arizona that the whole town had a slightly disbelieving quality to it. There were only 3 other people in the dining room and they left early, fighting their way through the wind to get home, and Myrtle had been cleaning the tables when Samuel came in late, stomping snow off his boots and sat down at the table nearest the stove. She brought him coffee without being asked, because she had learned his habits by then, and he wrapped his hands around the cup and looked up at her and said, "You're from Texas." It was not a question. She felt something move in her stomach, a cold slippage, and she kept her face still and said, "What makes you say that?" he said. "The way you say certain words, it's not strong. You've worked to soften it, but it's there." She looked at him. He looked back at her with those steady brown eyes that saw things without seeming to try, and she understood in that moment that this man was genuinely dangerous to her in a way that had nothing to do with iron or authority. He was dangerous because he was observant, and because he was kind, and because he did not seem to be looking for anything from her except perhaps the truth, and the truth was the one thing she absolutely could not give him. "I spent some time in Texas," she said carefully, "before I came west." He nodded, accepting this, and picked up his coffee, and she thought that was the end of it. But then he said, "I'm from Texas originally too, Travis County." "You," she said, "closer to the coast," which was true enough to be comfortable and vague enough to be safe. He nodded again and opened his book and let her go back to her cleaning, and she stood at the far end of the room wiping a table that was already clean and felt her heart beating harder than it should. The spring of 1882 came in dry and gold, and with it came a loosening of the tension that the cattle thieving situation had put on the town. Samuel had tracked the operation back to its source, a loosely organized group of men working out of a canyon 40 miles east, and with the help of 3 other deputies, he had arrested the ringleaders and sent them to Tucson for trial. The town was relieved and he was quietly satisfied, and he began spending his evenings differently, less urgently, sitting on the hotel porch in the warm dusks reading or talking with whoever came by. Myrtle began sitting on the porch too. Not because of him, she told herself, or at least not only because of him. The evenings were beautiful and she had worked hard all day and she deserved the quiet. She sat at the far end of the porch with her mending and he sat at the other end with his book, and gradually, over the course of several weeks, the space between them shortened. A comment about the weather, an observation about old Thomas Biggs and his opinions on coffee, a question about what he was reading, an answer that led to another question. The conversation that had been happening in pieces and whispers and careful increments finally became something with its own momentum, something she could feel pulling her forward the way a current pulls, gently but without pause. He had read extensively and thought carefully about what he read. He had opinions that he held firmly but not rigidly, and he could be moved by a good argument, which she discovered one evening when she disagreed with his assessment of a book she had also read, a dog-eared copy of Dickens that someone had left behind in one of the hotel rooms. She had made her case with more heat than she intended, and he had been silent for a moment and then said, "You know what, I think you're right," and looked at her with an expression she could not quite name, but that made her feel, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely seen. That was the beginning of the real trouble. She had been careful up until then to maintain a certain distance. Friendliness was part of Clara Wells, but closeness was dangerous, because closeness was how people got inside your defenses and found what was hiding there. She had kept even Dottie, who she genuinely liked, at a particular arm's length on certain subjects. But Samuel Lawson had a quality she had not encountered before, or not in this combination, which was that he was simultaneously perceptive enough to notice her barriers and gentle enough not to push against them. He never asked her anything she was not ready to answer. He never pressed. He simply kept showing up in the same space and being himself, steady and thoughtful and occasionally funny in the dry, understated way of men who rarely bother to be funny but who are very good at it when they try. By July of 1882, she was in serious trouble. She was in love with him. She had tried very hard not to be, and she had failed thoroughly, and the failure felt both wonderful and absolutely terrifying, because loving him meant wanting to tell him the truth, and telling him the truth meant destroying everything, and she was not sure which outcome frightened her more. She had heard nothing from Galveston. Nothing had come to redemption from her father or from Douglas Whitmore, and she had let herself hope, carefully and not too much, that the long arm of that particular darkness could not reach this far into the territory. She had perhaps grown a little careless with that hope. She had perhaps let herself believe that the woman named Myrtle Reed was truly, finally, gone. She should have known better. Hidden things have a way of traveling. In the late summer of 1882, a man arrived in redemption on the stage from Tucson. He said his name was Gerald Phelps, and he said he was a land surveyor, and he checked into the only room at the Copper Bell that was not occupied by Samuel Lawson. He was a slight man in his mid-30s, with a quality of watchfulness that Myrtle recognized because it was the same quality she herself possessed, the quality of someone who is gathering information rather than simply existing in a place. He ate his meals carefully and said very little and looked at people with a specific kind of attention that she identified on the second day as professional. He was not a land surveyor. She did not know for certain what he was, but the possibilities arranged themselves in her mind in order of likelihood, and none of them were good. Her father, when she had not come home after 3 months, might have hired someone. Douglas Whitmore, given what he had lost in the form of that property document, almost certainly had. She had always known this day might come. She had hoped it would not. She began to be very careful again. She watched Gerald Phelps with the peripheral attention of a woman who has had years of practice not appearing to watch, and she noticed that he watched her back with the same indirect care, and the dining room of the Copper Bell became a quiet theater of mutual observation that was exhausting in a way she could not explain to anyone. Samuel noticed her tension. He did not say so directly, but she saw him noticing it, saw the slight shift in his attention, the extra second of looking when she set his coffee down, the way he did not open his book some evenings but sat on the porch watching the street with the quiet alertness of a man who has learned to trust his own sense that something is off. One evening in early September, when the summer was finally beginning to loosen its grip and the nights came cooler, he said to her, "Are you all right, Clara?" She said, "Of course," he said, "because you seem like a person who is working very hard to seem like a person who is all right." She looked at him and he looked at her, and the evening light was coming down warm and golden across the porch boards, and she wanted more than she had ever wanted anything in her life to simply tell him. To say, "My name is not Clara Wells. I am Myrtle Reed, and I ran away from Galveston to escape a marriage I did not choose and a father who would not accept that my life was my own. And I have been Clara for nearly a year now, and sometimes I am not sure where she ends and I begin. And I think there is a man in your hotel who was sent here to find me and bring me back." She said none of this. She said, "I'm just tired, long week." He accepted it because that is what you do when someone closes a door. But she saw in his eyes that he did not entirely believe her, and this too was something she had to carry. Gerald Phelps left on the stage after 11 days without having appeared to do anything in particular. This should have relieved her. Instead, it made her more anxious, because she understood that his leaving meant he had either found nothing, which was possible but unlikely given how careful he had been, or he had found what he needed and was going back to report it. October came and went. November brought cold rains and mud. Samuel's work kept him busy with a new situation, a dispute over water rights between two ranching families that threatened to become something worse than a dispute, and he was gone from Redemption for stretches of several days at a time. When he came back, he looked tired in the way of a man who has been talking people out of things they wanted very badly to do, and she fed him and gave him coffee and watched him relax in increments across the supper hour. And she was so aware of him and so conscious of the weight of everything she was not saying that it felt sometimes like she was carrying the sky. Christmas of 1882 was quiet in Redemption. The town decorated the church, and there was a dinner in the community hall, and Myrtle, as Clara, made 3 pies with Dottie and helped hang paper chains from the rafters. Samuel was there, and there was a moment in the middle of the evening when the fiddle player started something slow, and people were dancing, and Samuel crossed the room and asked her if she would dance, and she said yes before she could think about whether she should. They danced twice. The second time he held her a little closer than the first time, which was proper enough but was also unmistakably more than politeness, and she could feel the warmth of his hand at her waist and the steadiness of him, and she looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and neither of them said anything, and it was both the best and the worst moment of her hidden life. Walking back to the hotel afterward through the cold blue dark, their breath making small clouds in the air between them, he said, "There are things you're not telling me," she said. "There are things everyone isn't telling everyone." He said, "That's true, but most people aren't as careful about it as you are." She stopped walking. They were between the lamplight of the hall and the lamplight of the hotel in the darkest part of the street, and she could only see him in outline and starlight and the faint reflection of snow on the mountains to the north. She said, "Samuel." He said, "Clara." And there it was, the name, her name that wasn't hers. She felt it like a stone in her mouth. She said, "I am exactly who I appear to be." He said, "I don't think that's true. But I'm not saying it's wrong, whatever you're doing. I just want you to know that if there's ever something I can help with, I would like to." She stood there in the dark and felt something in her chest crack open like ice in a thaw, something that wanted to reach toward him and something else, fiercer and more practiced, that pulled her back. She said, "Good night, Samuel," and walked the rest of the way to the hotel alone, and she lay awake most of that night staring at the ceiling of her small room and trying to find solid ground inside herself and failing. January of 1883 arrived cold and clear. The water rights situation had been resolved through a compromise that satisfied no one completely and therefore probably satisfied everyone adequately, and Samuel was back in redemption full time, and the days had settled into the rhythm that she had grown to love and fear in equal measure. Breakfast at the Copper Bell, his coffee, his book, the sound of his boots on the porch boards in the evenings. The conversations that had grown so natural and so rich that she sometimes forgot entirely, for long, beautiful minutes, that she was lying to him every moment she breathed. In February, a letter arrived for her. She knew it was trouble before she opened it because of the handwriting on the outside, which was not her father's and not Douglas Whitmore's, but which had a legal quality to it, the practiced slant of a man who writes official things for a living. She opened it in her room with the door locked and read it standing up. The letter was from a lawyer in Tucson. It was politely worded and entirely clear. Douglas Whitmore, it said, had filed a legal claim against a woman named Myrtle Reed, formerly of Galveston, Texas, for the theft of legal documents from his possession. There was a description of her. There was a description of the documents. There was a statement that the matter had been referred to the territorial marshal's office for investigation, as it involved property theft across state lines. She sat down on the bed. She held the letter with both hands and read it twice more to make sure she had understood it correctly. She had. The territorial marshal's office. The man who was the territorial marshal's representative in Redemption, Arizona, was Samuel Lawson. She had perhaps two choices and neither of them was good. She could leave. Pack what she could carry and leave Redemption before whatever official communication arrived at the marshal's desk, before Samuel received a description that matched the woman he had been eating breakfast with for over a year. Or she could stay and hope that something might intervene, that the description was vague enough, that the legal matter might dissolve, that Douglas Whitmore might decide the property documents were not worth pursuing across the territory. She thought about leaving Redemption. She thought about what that would mean. She thought about Dottie, who had been nothing but good to her. She thought about old Thomas Biggs and his opinions about coffee, and about Preacher Holloway's wife Margaret and the gentle afternoons on the porch. And she thought about Samuel. She thought about Samuel for a long time, sitting on the edge of her bed with the lawyer's letter in her hands, and then she folded the letter very carefully and put it inside her copy of Dickens, and she made herself a promise. She would stay until she absolutely could not. She would not run again unless she had no other choice. If she had been wrong about him, about what kind of man he was, then she would pay the price for that misjudgment. But she did not think she was wrong. She had less time than she had hoped. March came in with warm winds and the smell of dust and creosote, and something green trying to happen in the arroyos where the winter rain had pooled. She went about her days with the precise calm of a person who is walking toward something inevitable and has decided to do it with dignity. She waited. She watched Samuel's face for signs. She looked for the moment when his eyes would change, when the comfortable warmth in them would be replaced by something harder and more official. It came on a Thursday morning in early March. She saw it. She saw him come into the dining room with a slight deliberateness in his walk, a contained quality, and she knew before she reached his table that something had changed. He ordered breakfast as usual, and she brought it, and he ate quietly, and she went about her work, and they exchanged no more than a few words, and the normalcy of it was so perfectly performed on both sides that it would have fooled anyone who was not paying close attention. But she was always paying close attention, and so was he. That evening she was alone in the dining room after the supper hour, turning down the oil lamps and stacking the chairs, when he came in. He pulled out a chair and sat down at one of the remaining tables, not his usual table, and she understood from that small deviation that this was not an ordinary conversation. She set the chair she was holding carefully against the table and turned to face him. He said her name. He said, Myrtle Reed. And the world that she had built in the name of Clara Wells collapsed so quietly it barely made a sound. She did not drop the chair. She stood there with her hands at her sides, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and all the accumulated months of careful living sat between them like a river she did not know how to cross. She walked to the kitchen. She pressed her hands against the plaster wall and breathed, and then she did what she had always done with the hardest things in her life. She went back out to face them. He was still sitting at the table. He had not moved. He had his hands around his coffee cup again, that habitual gesture of comfort and steadiness, and when she came back into the room he looked up at her with an expression that she had been wrong about in the dark of the hotel porch back in December. She had thought it was suspicion. It was not suspicion. It was something that looked like worry. She sat down across from him. She folded her hands on the table. She said, "How long have you known?" He said, "I've known your name for 3 weeks. I've suspected something was hidden for most of the time I've been here." She said, "The lawyer's letter from Tucson." He said, "Yes." She looked at her hands. She said, "Then I suppose you have a duty to perform." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me what actually happened." She looked up at him. He was watching her with that steady, careful attention that had undone her since January of last year. And she understood that what she said in the next few minutes was going to matter enormously, not because it would change what he knew, but because it would tell him who she actually was. And she found, now that the moment had come, that she wanted him to know. She told him everything. She told him about Galveston and her father's house and the locked room and the window she had climbed out of. She told him about Douglas Whitmore and the way that man had looked at her, and the history of his first wife that no one remembered clearly, and the visceral certainty she had carried that she was being offered up to something dangerous disguised as respectability. She told him about the property documents and why she had taken them, not from greed, but from the calculated coldness of a woman, with very few weapons, buying herself a few weeks of running time. She told him about Tucson and the laundress work and the woman who had mentioned redemption. She told him about Clara Wells and the name she had built and the 22 months of living inside it. She told him all of it, and then she stopped, and the silence in the dining room was so complete that she could hear the oil lamp burning. Samuel said, "The documents. Do you still have them?" She said, "No. I mailed them back to Whitmore from Tucson before I came here, anonymously. I kept them long enough to buy time, and then I sent them back because I did not want to be a thief. I only wanted to be free." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "That makes the legal matter considerably more complicated for Whitmore." She said, "He still filed the claim." He said, "He filed a claim about documents that were returned. Without proof of ongoing possession, that claim gets very thin in a territorial court." She looked at him. She said carefully, "Are you trying to find me a way out of this?" He said, "I'm trying to understand the actual facts of the situation, which is what a good marshal does before he decides anything." She said, "And what have you decided?" He leaned forward slightly. He said, "I think Douglas Whitmore is a man who had what he wanted taken away from him and didn't like it. And I think he has more money than scruples. And so he found a lawyer and filed a claim that sounds serious, but that, when you look at it plainly, amounts to a woman borrowing some papers to help herself escape a situation she had every right to escape. And I think your father should have had the kind of decency toward his own daughter that would have prevented any of this." He paused. Then he said, quieter, "And I think I have spent 14 months trying very carefully not to fall in love with Clara Wells, and I have been completely unsuccessful at it." Myrtle sat very still. The oil lamp burned. The night pressed against the windows. She said, "My name is Myrtle." He said, "I know. I've known for 3 weeks, and I've been walking around with it and trying to figure out what the right thing to do was, and I kept coming back to the same answer, which is that the right thing to do is to tell you that I know and let you tell me the truth and see what we are to each other after that." She said, "And what are we?" He said, "I was hoping you might have a view on that." She looked at him across the table in the quiet dining room, and all the careful walls she had built over 2 years were simply gone, not broken down but dissolved, the way mist dissolves when the sun hits it, suddenly and completely, and leaving the air cleaner than it was before. She said, "I think I have been trying not to be in love with you for most of the last year. I have also been completely unsuccessful at it." He reached across the table and covered both her folded hands with one of his, and she turned her hands over and held on to him, and neither of them said anything else for a while. And she thought about how strange it was that the most terrifying moment of her hidden life was also the moment when she finally felt, for the first time since she had climbed out of a window in Galveston, completely safe. The practical problems did not dissolve as easily as the walls had, of course. There was the legal matter of Douglas Whitmore's claim, which was real even if it was thin. There was the question of her father, who presumably knew by now, through the same lawyer, roughly where his missing daughter was. There was the question of her real name and what it meant legally and socially in a town where she had been Clara Wells for nearly 2 years. Samuel handled the legal matter with the systematic thoroughness that was his most consistent quality. He wrote to the territorial marshal's office in Tucson, explaining the circumstances of the case as he had investigated them, and he was careful and precise in his language, noting that the documents in question had been returned to their owner prior to any official complaint being filed, that there was no evidence of financial gain or ongoing possession, and that the original circumstances, specifically a woman fleeing a coerced marital arrangement, created significant mitigating context. He wrote a second letter directly to a circuit judge he knew in Tucson, a man named Hargrove who had a reputation for taking a broad view of the law when that view served justice better than a narrow one. He also wrote a third letter, this one addressed to Douglas Whitmore's lawyer, which Myrtle was not shown but which Samuel told her was firmly worded, and which she suspected, based on everything she knew about Samuel Lawson, was also entirely within the bounds of legal and professional propriety, while leaving absolutely no doubt about what a territorial marshal who had investigated the matter found to be the factual and legal situation. All of this took time, and during that time Myrtle continued to work at the Copper Bell, but she was no longer Clara Wells. She had gone to Dottie the morning after her conversation with Samuel, while it was still early, and the kitchen smelled of coffee, and the day was just beginning to assert itself through the windows, and she had sat down at the kitchen table, and she had told Dottie Crane her real name. Dottie had listened with the focused attention of a woman who has heard more confessions across her kitchen table than most preachers hear in a year. She had not interrupted. When Myrtle was done, Dottie had been quiet for a moment, and then she had said, "Well, I've always thought Clara was a slightly stiff name for you anyway." Myrtle had laughed. It was the kind of laugh that comes from the deep part of you, the part that has been held in for so long that when it finally comes out, it comes out shaking. And Dottie had put her arm around her and said, "You're not going anywhere, Myrtle Reed. This is your home and these are your people, and anyone who says different is going to have to explain themselves to me, and I can be very difficult to explain things to." Telling the rest of redemption was a slower and more complicated process. Samuel helped with that too, in his understated way, by simply being present and treating the information as something that deserved a calm and matter-of-fact response, rather than shock or scandal. Old Thomas Biggs, when she told him, squinted at her for a long moment and then said, "Are you still making my coffee the same way?" She said, "Yes," he said. "Then I don't see what the fuss is about." Preacher Holloway's wife Margaret was harder, not because she was unkind but because she was genuinely hurt, and Myrtle had to sit with that hurt honestly and acknowledge it. She had misled Margaret. She had misled everyone. She had done it because she was afraid, and because she had no better options, but that did not make the misleading less real. Margaret cried a little and held Myrtle's hands and said she understood, but that she wished things had been different. And Myrtle said so did she. And they sat together on the porch in the warmth of a March afternoon, and were honest with each other in a way they had never quite managed to be before, and it was better than any conversation they had previously had. There were one or two people in Redemption who found the deception unforgivable, which was their right, and Myrtle accepted it without arguing. She could not control every outcome. She could only be honest going forward and let the chips fall where they were going to fall. April arrived, and with it, a response from Judge Hargrove in Tucson. The judge declined to pursue the legal claim filed by Douglas Whitmore, on the grounds that the property in question had been returned prior to any official proceeding, and that the broader circumstances of the complaint, as investigated and reported by the territorial marshal, did not in his view constitute a criminal matter. He also noted, in language that was judicial and measured, but carried a distinct undertone of moral opinion, that parties who file claims motivated primarily by personal grievance and with insufficient legal foundation were not well served by the judicial system's resources. Myrtle read the letter 3 times. Then she gave it back to Samuel and went out behind the hotel and stood in the small yard where Dottie grew her kitchen herbs, and she stood there in the April sunlight with her hands at her sides and let herself feel, one by one, all the things she had been storing up for 2 years. Fear, relief, anger, grief, and underneath all of it, pushing up through like the green things pushing up through the Arizona dirt, something that felt remarkably like hope. Samuel found her there. He always seemed to know where she was, which she had noticed and which she had decided was a quality she was willing to be found by. He came and stood beside her and looked at the herb garden and said, "It's over. The legal piece of it." She said, "I know," he said. "Your father may still try something," she said. "My father is in Galveston and I am in Arizona, and I am not the same woman who climbed out of his window. If he comes here or sends someone here, they will find a woman with a territorial marshal in her corner and a kitchen full of people who know her real name and intend to use it." Samuel smiled at that. He had a smile that he used sparingly, which made each instance of it feel like something to hold on to, and he turned and looked at her in the April sunlight and said, "There is something I want to ask you." She said, "Then ask it." He said, "I have been in Redemption for 15 months and I have every reason to believe I will be here considerably longer. And I am 30 years old and I have spent a good deal of those years being alone in ways that seemed sensible at the time and now seem considerably less so. And I find that I am in love with Myrtle Reed, which I want to say clearly because I was in love with Clara Wells for a long time without being able to say anything about it, and I am done with being unable to say things." She said, "Samuel," he said, "I would very much like it if you would marry me, Myrtle. If you want to, you don't have to want to, but I am asking." She looked at him standing there in the herb garden with the sun on him, and the smell of sage coming up from the ground around them and the whole wide Arizona sky above. And she thought about her mother's house in Galveston and the locked room and the window and the train west and the long, careful years of Clara Wells. And she thought about what she had been building toward without knowing it, and she said, "Yes, Samuel, I would very much like that." He put his arms around her right there in the herb garden, and she put her face against his chest, and felt the solid warmth of him and the beat of his heart through his shirt. And she thought that of all the places she had ever been, this was the first one that felt entirely like home. They were married in June of 1883, in Redemption's small white church, On a morning when the sky was the precise and extravagant blue that the Arizona sky sometimes achieves in early summer, a blue that looks painted and is real. Dottie Crane stood up with Myrtle and cried without apology, and told everyone afterward that she was not crying from sentiment, but from relief that Samuel had finally gotten around to it. Old Thomas Biggs wore his good hat. Preacher Halloway performed the ceremony with a warmth that Myrtle felt was genuine, and Margaret Halloway sat in the front pew with her handkerchief at the ready and used it thoroughly. Samuel had borrowed a ring from the goldsmith in Tucson who came through Redemption monthly, and it was a simple ring, a band of yellow gold with a small turquoise stone set in it that was locally sourced and the particular blue-green of shallow water. And when Samuel put it on her finger, he held her hand for a moment afterward and looked at her, and she understood that this was a man who intended to keep every promise he made. They settled into a life together that was built on honesty in the way that only a relationship that begins with the full truth can be built. Samuel continued his work as territorial marshal, which meant he was sometimes gone for stretches of days and once, in the following autumn, for nearly 3 weeks when a serious situation developed north of Redemption that required his presence. Myrtle continued working at the Copper Bell for the first year of their marriage, not because they needed the money, since Samuel's salary was adequate for their needs, but because she genuinely wanted to, and because Dottie genuinely needed her, and because the Copper Bell was as much a part of her as anything else in Redemption by now. She also began, in that first year, doing something she had not done since Galveston. She began reading law in earnest. There were no female lawyers in Arizona Territory in 1883, and she was not naive about what that meant practically. But she understood the law now in a way she had not before her own experience of it, both its power and its gaps, and the places where it failed the people it was supposed to serve, and she wanted to understand it more fully. She borrowed everything Samuel had and wrote letters to Tucson for more, and she read in the evenings and discussed what she read with Samuel, who engaged with her arguments seriously and pushed back when he thought she was wrong, and said so clearly when he thought she was right. In the spring of 1884, she discovered she was pregnant. She told Samuel on a Sunday morning when the sun was coming through the windows of the small house they had built at the edge of Redemption, a practical house with a deep porch and a good kitchen, and a bedroom that faced the mountains. He had been at the table with his coffee, and she had sat down across from him and taken his hand and told him, and he had looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had no adequate vocabulary for, something full and quiet and entirely his own, and then he had said, "Are you all right?" She had said, "I'm very well. I'm happy." He had said, "So am I," and the simplicity of it was perfect. Their son was born in November of 1884 at the Copper Bell, where the bedroom was larger and Dottie could be on hand, which Myrtle had insisted on, and Samuel had agreed to after a short negotiation. They named him James, after Samuel's father, with Everett as a middle name in a gesture toward Myrtle's own complicated inheritance, keeping the name but choosing to carry it on her own terms. James arrived in a cold snap, on a night when frost glittered on the porch rails and the whole world smelled of cold air and wood smoke, and he was loud and emphatic from his first moments in the world, which Dottie said was a sign of excellent character. Samuel held his son with the focused care of a man who is aware that he is holding something more important than anything he has previously been responsible for. He sat in the chair beside the bed where Myrtle was resting, and he held James and looked down at him and then looked over at Myrtle and said, "He has your determination already. Look at the expression on him." She looked and she laughed, and then she said, "Come here." He came and sat on the edge of the bed beside her, and she leaned against him, and he kept his arm carefully around her, and held James in the other arm, and outside the frost crystals formed on the window glass in the slow, patient way of natural things, and she felt with complete certainty that she had arrived somewhere real. Life in Redemption continued to unfold in the way of good lives in small places, full of small things that accumulate into something substantial. James grew from a loud, emphatic baby into a loud, emphatic toddler who learned to walk by falling toward things he wanted, and who had his father's steady gaze and his mother's appetite for understanding how things worked. Samuel took him to the stable when James was barely 2 and let him touch the horses and watch the blacksmith and ask questions in the one-word demanding way of very small children. And Samuel answered every question with the same seriousness he would have applied to a legal inquiry. In 1886, they had a second child, a daughter they named Ruth, who was quieter than her brother and appeared to have inherited the observational quality that Myrtle recognized as her own, the ability to sit in a room and take in everything without appearing to try. Ruth had dark hair and her father's brown eyes, and a way of watching the world that suggested she was already forming opinions about it. Myrtle had continued her reading and her thinking about the law, and in 1885 she had begun helping Dottie navigate a property dispute that had arisen between the hotel and the new owner of the building next door, who had some creative interpretations of the shared easement that ran between the two properties. Myrtle had researched the territorial property statutes and the relevant precedents, and had written a clear and well-argued letter that Dottie sent to the relevant county clerk, and the matter had been resolved entirely in Dottie's favor within 6 weeks. Word got around, as it does in small towns, and she found herself being consulted informally by 2 or 3 other people over the following year with similar problems, always careful to acknowledge that she had no formal legal standing, always directing them to an actual lawyer when the matter was serious enough to require one. But the thinking continued, and the reading continued, and Samuel, watching this, said one evening in the summer of 1886, "There are schools in the East. Some of them are beginning to accept women," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not saying you should leave. I'm saying you could. Or you could train formally here in some capacity. Or you could keep doing what you're doing and call it something else. I'm saying the option exists." She looked at him. She said, "You would be all right with that, with any of those things," he said. "I am in love with a woman who has never stopped thinking clearly about the world even when the world gave her every reason to stop. I would be a very foolish man to discourage that." She said, "You are not a foolish man." He said, "I try not to be." They talked about it over many evenings, the way they talked about everything, carefully and honestly, and with room for both of them to change position as the conversation developed. What she eventually settled on was something particular to the shape of her own life. She began working formally with the lawyer in Tucson, a man named Robert Cahill, who came through the territory monthly, as an assistant and researcher, using her 2 solid years of self-directed study and her increasingly detailed knowledge of the relevant statutes to help prepare cases and documents. Cahill was initially skeptical, which was honest, and then he was impressed, which was also honest, and he told Samuel on one of his visits to Redemption that his wife had one of the clearest legal minds he had encountered in 10 years of practice, and that he intended to help her pursue whatever formal credentials became available. Samuel told Myrtle this, and she sat with it for a while, and then she said, "I think that is the most useful thing that has happened to me professionally in a very long time." He said, "I think you should let it happen," she said. "I intend to." In 1887, a letter arrived in Redemption from Galveston. It was addressed to Myrtle Reed Lawson, which meant her father had finally found a way to acknowledge both the name she had been born with and the life she had built. She opened it at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold beside her, and Samuel standing in the doorway giving her the space to do it privately, while also making it clear that he was there. The letter was from her father. Everett Reed was 61, and, as the letter told her in language that was carefully controlled but not entirely devoid of feeling, not well. He had had a problem with his heart the previous winter, a warning from his body that he was apparently taking seriously. The letter was not an apology in any direct or explicit sense. It was a man who was not practiced at humility, attempting something in its general direction, which she recognized as the best he could probably do and chose to receive it as such. He said he hoped she was well. He said he understood she was married. He said Douglas Whitmore had moved to New Orleans some years ago and was, as far as he knew, no longer pursuing any legal matters related to her, which she already knew but which it meant something to hear him say. At the end of the letter, her father said that her mother would have been proud of her. He did not say he was proud of her himself, which she noticed but did not dwell on. He said her mother would have been proud, which was perhaps as honest a thing as he knew how to write. She wrote back. She wrote a letter that was civil and contained and careful, and she told him about her life in honest terms, about redemption and about her work and about James and Ruth and about Samuel, and she did not say everything she might have said about the locked room and the window and the winter of 1881, because that was all history now, and she was not interested in reopening it for the purposes of victory. She was interested in moving forward. That was all she had ever been interested in. She signed it with her full name, Myrtle Reed Lawson, both parts equally hers. The summer of 1887 was the best one she could remember since her childhood. The rains came in their season, and the desert greened up in the brief extravagant way it does, and James was nearly 3 and curious about everything, and Ruth was a year old and beginning to communicate in words and gestures and expressions that made everyone in the household laugh. Samuel was home more than usual that summer, the territory having achieved a relative and welcome quiet, and they spent the warm evenings on the deep porch of their house with the children and the mountain air coming down cool off the ridges, and the stars coming out one by one in the enormous desert sky. Samuel had a habit in those evenings of reaching over and taking her hand while they sat on the porch, just picking it up and holding it, not for any purpose but the simple fact of it, and she had a corresponding habit of turning her hand to hold his back, and they would sit like that for long, comfortable stretches of silence in which everything important was said. One of those evenings when James was in bed and Ruth had fallen asleep in Myrtle's arms and the night was coming down warm and full of cricket sound, Samuel said, "Do you ever miss her? Clara Wells?" She thought about it seriously, which he knew she would. Then she said, "I miss the version of being Clara who got to fall in love with you without knowing she was doing it. That was a very pure kind of feeling, uncomplicated," he said. "And now," she said, "now it's complicated and better, much better. Clara was a woman who could only be safe. Myrtle gets to be everything else too," he said. "I'm glad you told me your name." She said, "You told me my name, I just confirmed it." He laughed, soft and real, and leaned over and kissed her temple, and she shifted Ruth carefully in her arms and leaned her head against his shoulder, and looked out at the desert dark and the star-strewn sky, and felt the full weight of where she was and how she had gotten there, and was grateful for every step of it, even the hard ones, because the hard ones had led here, and here was exactly where she was supposed to be. 2 seasons of hiding, and all it had taken to end them was one man with steady brown eyes and a willingness to say the truth out loud in a quiet room, and then everything else had become possible. Redemption in the late 1880s was changing, as the whole Arizona territory was changing, growing and filling in and beginning to show the shape of what it was going to become. The railroad had come through a town 30 miles to the north, and the effects of that were trickling down into the region in the form of new goods and new people, and a general sense that the world beyond the desert ridges was a little closer than it used to be. Samuel's work as Marshal continued to evolve with the territory, less about cattle thieves now and more about the complicated jurisdictional questions that arose when more people were living in proximity to each other and wanting different things. Myrtle's work with Robert Cahill had grown into something that both of them had come to take seriously. She traveled with him to Tucson twice a year, and she sat in on proceedings when Cahill could arrange it. and she read the new legal publications that came through by mail and discussed them with Cahill and with Samuel, and wrote up her own analyses of the significant decisions and how they related to the territorial statutes. There was talk in 1888 of a territorial law school being established in Tucson, a conversation that was still preliminary and uncertain, but that Cahill mentioned to her in a letter with the note that, when it became a reality, he intended to recommend her as a member of the founding class. In the meantime, she was doing work that mattered. She had helped 5 different people in and around Redemption navigate legal situations that would have been much worse without her involvement. She had helped a widow named Florencia Vega hold on to her property when the neighboring ranch tried to claim an easement right that did not legally exist. She had helped a family named Bright recover wages that a mining company had withheld on specious grounds. She was not able to practice law formally, and she was not pretending to. She was using what she knew to help people who had less recourse than they deserved, which was what the law was supposed to do when it was working. In 1888, she became pregnant again. She told Samuel in the kitchen on a morning in February when the cold was still sharp and the coffee was hot, and James, now 4, was engaged in a complicated engineering project with a collection of wooden spoons on the kitchen floor. Samuel looked at her across the kitchen, and she looked at him, and he said, "How are you feeling?" She said, "Hopeful," he said. "That seems right." Their second son was born in September of 1888, a boy they named William, who arrived with considerably less drama than his brother and immediately demonstrated a preference for sleeping over everything else, which Myrtle said was a sign of excellent judgment and Samuel said was a mercy. James was fascinated by his new brother in the focused, critical way of 4-year-olds, spending long minutes studying William's face as if cataloging details for future use. And Ruth, at 3, took a more pragmatic view that primarily involved checking whether William was affecting the distribution of her own resources in any meaningful way and determining that he was not. The household expanded to hold them all without particular difficulty, the way good households do, the way places do when they have been built with enough room for what is actually going to happen rather than just what is planned. Samuel built a second room onto the house that autumn, a comfortable project for which he recruited old Thomas Biggs and 2 of the younger men from town, and which he completed with the same methodical care he applied to everything. And Myrtle painted the interior walls herself with a whitewash she mixed, and stood back and looked at the finished room, and felt the particular satisfaction of people who have built the life they live rather than fallen into it. By the winter of 1888, Myrtle Reed Lawson was 29 years old and had been in Redemption for 7 years. She was known by her real name now throughout the whole of the region, a woman who had started over and made something solid of it, and the 2 seasons of Clara Wells were not forgotten exactly, but they had taken their proper place, a chapter in the longer story rather than the story itself. She thought sometimes about what she would say to the woman who had climbed out of the window in Galveston in February of 1881, if she could somehow speak backward through the years to her. She thought she would say, "The fear will not go away quickly and the hiding will cost you things you cannot get back, but you are building toward something real, and the man who is waiting for you in a small town in the Arizona desert is worth every mile of the difficult road." She thought she would say, "Take your name with you when you go. You will need it again." She was sitting on the porch with Samuel on a December evening in 1888, a cold, clear night with the stars burning fierce and the mountains dark against the sky, when he said, "Are you happy?" She considered the question with the fullness it deserved. She thought about everything that had come before this moment and everything that was present in it. The house behind them warm with lamplight and 3 sleeping children and the smell of supper and wood smoke, and the man beside her with his hand covering hers on the porch railing, and the desert stretched out in every direction under the extravagant winter stars. She said, "Completely." He squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. They sat there in the cold and the quiet and the dark and were entirely home. The year of 1889 brought changes to the territory that everyone had been anticipating, and some that no one had. The question of Arizona's eventual statehood was becoming more actively discussed in political circles, a process that was going to take years, but that was clearly moving forward. And with it came an increasing professionalization of territorial institutions that affected everyone who worked within them. Samuel's position was formalized and expanded, with a proper territorial stipend and a new jurisdiction arrangement that made his responsibilities clearer and his authority more defined. He was offered a position in Tucson as a senior marshal, which would have meant more money and more status, and a much longer daily commute from everything they had built in Redemption. He turned it down, which surprised the people in Tucson who had made the offer and did not surprise Myrtle at all. He told her about the offer the evening he received it, sitting at their kitchen table while the children were in bed, and he said, "I told them no." She said, "You didn't have to do that." He said, "I know, I wanted to. Redemption is where our life is. I'm not interested in a different life." She looked at him. She said, "You could have at least discussed it with me before declining." He said, "You're right, I should have. I apologize." And he meant it, which was why she did not pursue the point further. She appreciated a man who could apologize cleanly and without elaborate justification. She said, "For what it's worth, I would not have asked you to take it. This is where our life is for me too." He said, "I know. That's partly why I said no." The territorial law school in Tucson that Robert Cahill had mentioned years earlier was officially established in 1890 as part of a broader expansion of the territorial university. Cahill, as promised, wrote a letter recommending Myrtle for the inaugural program. She was 31 years old, with 3 children, a husband, and 7 years of self-directed study behind her. She was accepted. The program was designed for working professionals and ran intensive sessions in Tucson twice a year, with correspondence study in between, which meant it was possible, if demanding, to pursue it while remaining based in Redemption. Samuel reorganized the household logistics with the same focused attention he would have brought to a complex territorial operation. Dottie, who was genuinely delighted, said she would have the children any time she was needed. Margaret Halloway offered her help freely and warmly, and their friendship, which had survived honesty and come out the other side, had by now grown into something with real roots. Old Thomas Biggs, when he heard, said it was about time someone in Redemption was a lawyer, and did she know how to file a complaint about the quality of the new baker's biscuits, because, in his view, it was actionable. She sat in her first formal lecture in Tucson in the autumn of 1890 in a room with 17 men and 4 other women, and a professor from back east who spoke carefully and precisely, and without any apparent concern about the composition of his audience. And she felt something she recognized from years ago, from the girl who had read everything she could find in Galveston and absorbed it and made it part of herself. She felt the pleasure of a mind doing what it was made to do. She wrote to Samuel that evening from the boarding house where she stayed during the Tucson sessions, a long letter full of the ideas she had encountered in the first day's lectures and her own responses to them, and the questions she was already forming. He wrote back within the week, a letter that was shorter but equally substantive, responding to her ideas and adding his own perspective from the practical application side, because he had spent nearly a decade enforcing the law and had views about where it worked and where it didn't that were grounded in specific experience. They wrote back and forth through the weeks of her first session, and she kept all his letters in a bundle tied with a piece of cord, and read them over on difficult evenings when the work was hard and the distance from home felt long. She came back from Tucson in November with a head full of new ideas and an armload of law books, and James, now 6 and deeply serious about several things he had decided mattered, who met her at the door and gave her a full accounting of everything she had missed in her absence, and Ruth, 5 and watchful as always, who simply came and took her hand and held it, and William, 22 and enthusiastic, who had recently mastered the word mama and was prepared to use it continuously. Samuel had made supper. He had done this consistently during her absence and continued to do it sometimes afterward because he was good at it, and because it seemed to him a reasonable distribution of the household work. He looked up when she came in and smiled the particular spare smile that was entirely his and said, "Welcome home, Myrtle Reed." She set her books down and walked across the kitchen and kissed him, which she did not always do immediately because there were children present and she was a reasonably dignified person. But she had been gone for 3 weeks, and the letter correspondence, excellent as it was not the same as the man himself. He put his arms around her and held her for a moment, and the kitchen smelled of food and warmth, and the children were talking simultaneously at roughly equal volume, and she thought, this exactly. The years that followed were full in every possible sense. The law program, the children growing, Samuel's work. Her own work, which grew steadily more substantial as her credentials accumulated, and she became, by the mid-1890s, one of the few formally trained legal practitioners in the southern part of the territory. She took on cases that mattered, the kinds of cases that no one with other options was lining up to take, cases involving the people who had the fewest protections and the most need of them. She was not able to save everyone. She was able to help more people than would otherwise have had any help at all, and she held that as something real. She and Samuel argued sometimes, in the way of people who are both strong-willed and in the habit of honesty. They argued about legal philosophy and about household matters, and once memorably about the best route across the territory, which was a 4-day argument that ended inconclusively, and which both of them enjoyed more than they admitted. They were never cruel to each other, which she thought was perhaps the most important thing. They had both, in their different ways and for their different reasons, had enough of cruelty and had decided it was not going to be part of what they built together. Dottie Crane retired from the Copper Bell in 1893, when the work became more than she could manage without help she could not afford, and she sold the hotel to a young couple who had come from California, and who ran it differently but who kept the same dining room and the same kitchen, and the same general quality of welcome that had made it what it was. Dottie moved into a small house 2 streets from Myrtle and Samuel's, which was exactly where she should have been all along, and she spent her retirement expressing opinions about everything in Redemption and being thoroughly invaluable. James, Ruth, and William grew up in Redemption and became themselves in the specific ways that children do when they are given the space to do so. James, methodical and serious, went to study engineering in Tucson when he was 18, which he had been planning since he was approximately 6. Ruth, who had been watching and forming opinions since before she could properly speak, showed an early aptitude for the same kind of legal thinking her mother had, and Myrtle approached this with the careful balance of a woman who wanted to encourage without directing, letting Ruth find her own way to it. William, easygoing and sociable and possessed of his grandmother's eye for people, took over the management of the Copper Bell from the California couple in his mid-20s, which turned out to be exactly what both he and the hotel needed. In the summer of 1895, Myrtle received a letter from Galveston. This one was not from her father. Her father had died the previous winter, a second and final problem with his heart, and she had learned of it through an earlier letter, and had sat with the complicated grief of it for several weeks, grieving not what he had been, but what he might have been, the version of him that her mother's photograph suggested had once existed before the world or his own nature had narrowed him down. This new letter was from her eldest sister, Caroline, who had apparently found Myrtle's address in their father's papers and had written on an impulse she hoped was not unwelcome. It was not unwelcome. Myrtle wrote back to Caroline, and the correspondence continued, carefully at first and then with increasing warmth as they reconstructed the shape of each other across the distance of decades. Caroline had 5 children and a husband in San Antonio, and a life that sounded solid and good. She had not known, she wrote, everything that had happened with their father and Douglas Whitmore. She had known there was a difficulty and had chosen, to her own lasting shame, not to look more closely at it. She was sorry, she wrote. She said it plainly, and she said it without elaborate justification, and Myrtle received it the same way. The sisters began visiting, first by letter and then in person, Caroline making the trip to Redemption in the spring of 1896 and staying for 2 weeks. And the reunion was complicated and funny and real, and included a great deal of talking on the porch in the evenings that covered both the ground that had been lost and the ground that they were laying fresh. Samuel, who had heard the whole story of Galveston years ago and held it carefully, treated Caroline with the same steady warmth he gave everyone, which was exactly right. By the late 1890s, Redemption was no longer the small, isolated town it had been when Myrtle arrived on a September afternoon in 1881 with a borrowed name and a carpetbag full of things she could not leave behind. It had grown. The railroad had finally reached it in 1894, which changed everything the way railroads changed everything, bringing more people and more goods and more connection to the wider world, and with them, the particular bittersweet quality of progress, that what you gain in possibility you sometimes lose in particular character. But the bones of the place were still what they had always been, the red rock ridges, the deep sky, the well in the center of the square around which the town told itself its news. She still loved it. She walked through it on her way to her office, which she had rented on the main street in 1892, and which had her name on the door, her full name, Myrtle Reed Lawson, and she felt the streets under her feet as something she belonged to rather than something she was passing through, which was a feeling she had spent too long without and had learned not to take for granted. She was 40 years old in 1898, and she did not feel old. She felt, if anything, more fully herself than she ever had, which was something she had heard older women say when she was young and had taken on faith and now understood from the inside. The various selves she had been, the girl in Galveston, Clara Wells, and the woman she was now, had not replaced each other but had accumulated, and she carried all of them and was larger for it. Samuel was 40 at this point too, having been born in the same year, and he wore the decade well in the way of men who have spent their lives in honest physical work and honest dealing. His hair had some gray in it, and the lines at the corners of his eyes had deepened, and he looked, she thought, like exactly the person he was, which she considered a significant achievement and told him so on his 40th birthday, which she marked with a supper she cooked herself with Dottie's assistance, their kitchen full of children and neighbors and Dottie's running commentary on everything. He said, "Thank you for the supper and thank you for the compliment, and I am the luckiest man in the Arizona Territory and possibly in several adjacent territories as well." She said, "You are certainly the most self-aware." He said, "I learned from the best." She laughed and handed him his cake, and he ate it with the expression of a man who is thoroughly satisfied with his life and knows it. There was a moment that year, late in the autumn, when the evenings were coming earlier, and the desert had its cool, dry smell, and the mountains to the north had a faint dusting of early snow on their highest points, when she sat on the porch after supper with her legal papers in her lap, and looked up at the sky, and thought about the woman she had been 17 years ago, climbing out of a window in February with a carpetbag and $47 and a stub of pencil and a small photograph of her mother. That woman had not known what she was doing exactly. She had known what she was running from, and she had known it with absolute clarity, the kind of clarity that fear provides when it is combined with intelligence. But she had not known what she was running toward. She had trusted that there was something to run toward, and she had been right. More right than she had dared to hope in the cold dark of the Galveston rail station, more right than she had believed possible in the careful, lonely years of Clara Wells. Samuel came out onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee and sat down beside her and handed her one. And she wrapped her hands around it the way she had seen him do 1,000 times at the Copper Bell in what seemed like another life and also like yesterday. And she leaned against him and he put his arm around her and they looked at the desert evening together. She said, "I've been thinking about the window." He knew what she meant. He always knew what she meant, which was one of the great luxuries of a long marriage, not having to explain the context. He said, "The window in Galveston," she said. "I have been thinking about her, the woman who climbed out of it." She was so frightened and so determined at the same time. I wonder what she would think of this. She gestured broadly, meaning all of it, the house and the mountains and the office with her name on the door and the children and the man beside her. He said, "I think she would be very relieved." She said, "I think she would be astonished." He said, "Both things can be true." She tilted her face up toward him, and he bent his head down and kissed her, slow and easy and entirely sure of itself. The kiss of 2 people who have been kissing each other for 15 years and have not gotten tired of it. And the evening came down all around them in shades of gold and purple and deep blue. And somewhere in the town, a lamp was lit. And somewhere a child called out, and the desert night took its great patient breath. Myrtle Reed Lawson set her coffee down and put her hand flat against her husband's chest, feeling the solid living warmth of him, and she thought, "This is my real name. Not Clara, not even just Myrtle. This whole life is my real name. This is the thing I was building all along without knowing what I was building." She picked up her coffee again and leaned back against him and looked at the stars as they appeared, one by one in the deepening Arizona sky, and she was exactly where she had been heading since the moment she stepped out into the cold February wind off the Gulf of Mexico and began to walk. She was home. She was known. She was loved. She was Myrtle Reed, and she was finally fully free.